I'm sure you all expected this video to be uploaded at some point soon. The long-awaited yap about Arcadion Savage. It's been almost 2 weeks at this point since the tier released, with record clear rates across the board. The most week 1 full tier clears ever in Final Fantasy XIV's history, in fact. 1,000,001 different strats and more than its fair share of memes. It's fair to say that the bosses in this tier have made a huge impact on the community, with their strong, distinct characterizations and designs, and a set of truly banger boss themes to complement them perfectly. I've done each of the 4 encounters at least 4 or 5 times a piece at this point. It's fair to say I'm pretty confident on their ins and outs, and I've ruminated enough to land on a concrete, finalized opinion. I don't want to discuss them in depth. Today I'll be answering the following questions. Which fight is the best? Is this a good raid tier? Am I still a Honeybee Lovely stan? I'll first look into each of the rounds individually, and then at the end I have a few overall thoughts about the tier that I want to voice and hear your opinions on as well. Let's get into it. You face Black Cat in round 1, and when I did the normal mode of this encounter I had pretty high hopes. The potential was there, both in the arena floor tile breakages and in the sheer speed of some of the mechanics, like Mouser being a shining example. I had a good feeling. How did it hold up coming out of the tail end after Savage? Pretty well, honestly, all things considered. I think this is a good opening foray for dawntrail Savage encounters. A good chunk of its major mechanics center around your memory, and test your capability to remember which cat clone is going to be doing what mechanic, in which order, or at other points to keep track of which side will be cleaved first, to effectively avoid the repeat attack from one of the 8 clones that appear throughout the fight's runtime. This entire set piece with the numerous sleeping Black Cat clones in general is really interesting. Not only do you have this memory component and the necessity to react to whether supports will need to go in first or DPS first on very short notice, with a number of different permutations to order and positioning requirements that help it feel fairly fresh despite repeat pulls. This is also a standout example of a phase that properly tests tanks in their ability to position a boss well. The difference that a good tank versus an average one can make here is drastic. One knowledgeable and experienced tank can make this entire mechanic almost non-existent for the rest of the party, by smartly and carefully positioning the real Black Cat in advance of the clones activating, allowing melee to easily keep their positionals and uptime, and dispelling any potential confusion that might take place from the nature of the mechanics themselves. After an entire expansion of unengaging, massive boss hitboxes with little active positioning, this was a welcome change, and you can really tell which players have experience and awareness in boss positioning versus those that were brought up in Endwalker. What is a crying shame though is that this is the only real standout moment in terms of tanking this entire raid tier, so make the most of this, because it's only downhill from here. I also really like how they handle the platforms. I think it made for a very satisfying Savage variant. The floor smashing really is barely different from normal mode, but the normal mode cracks in and of themselves were fast enough to be engaging. I think the only problem with it, as with many of these simple mechanics in FF14, is the fact that there are only 2 possible patterns. This makes it so that you don't even need to pay attention to the floor telegraphs at all. You just need to check if you're going to be going right then left, or right then stay. See if you've done the fight, you don't even need to ask where from, because you do the exact same thing as me. After that though, you get to the Mouser mechanic, where the Black Cat clone will either bap you upwards, sending you flying, or smash you down against the arena. This mechanic is fun to do and highlights another thing that this tier is exemplary for, having numerous resolutions for phases. Not just 1 or 2 either, but so many ways that you can get through these platforms unscathed. You can wing it with the ordering or set up concrete rules, you can get knocked forwards, backwards, diagonally, or even make it so that you stay on the same tile you were knocked from. Even the knockbacks to signify the end of the mechanic and the accompanying arena rebuild are good, because you can't use your knockback prevention on them and they go way further than you'd think, forcing you to engage with the mechanic properly. One thing I found a little odd, which is a recurring thing I'll bring up again related to other fights later in the video, is the fact that there are numerous mechanics in M1S that are almost completely unchanged from their normal mode variants in both presentation and challenge. just with very slightly altered patterns offered or an additional component so minuscule and throwaway that it barely need exist in the first place. This Devour-esque mechanic is a great example of that, where it is practically identical to the normal mode version, just with the addition of a left and right arena cleave immediately afterwards that needs to be avoided. That's it. No other meaningful changes. It feels a bit lazy to me, as traditionally Savage likes to take the individual components present in normal mode, but repackage them in a way that makes them feel very different from their easier format. If you look back at some of the previous tiers, you'll see that the Savage modes and the normal modes are almost completely unrecognizable from one another, whereas these fights are actually very recognizable when you go from Savage back to normal. That said, it is an interesting mechanic to attempt to keep melee uptime on, that much is for sure, and I definitely appreciate it for that. I also want to take a moment to big up the Enrage for this fight. I saw a clip of it on Twitter and it is so good. The boss one by one shatters the arena tiles until at last the final one falls and the party hits the mud. It's really good stuff. Interestingly, there's also no raid-wide magic damage in Black Cat until a good 4 minutes through the fight as well, when the first knockback at the end of Mouser happens. Every major hit prior to this is physical. I've actually seen 1 or 2 complaints about this, as it lessens the impact that caster mitigations like Addle, and more importantly tank mits like Heart of Light and Dark Missionary can have in turning the tide. Cooldowns like Paladins and Warriors become much more versatile in most of this encounter as a result, especially during that first half. I actually think this is a good thing. Not only have I been in favor of jobs being unique, but also of encounters presenting challenges and damage profiles that are not afraid to specifically benefit one or a handful of jobs over others. It is okay for one job to be better at a specific mechanic, phase, or even fight than the others are, especially in terms of capability to mitigate or provide uptime, as long as that variance falls the other way at some other point. With how much Square Enix love to lean on magic damage and have done for such a long time at this point, a physical focus in M1S is perfectly reasonable. If you don't like it, the armory system exists and is one of the greatest boons of FF14 as an MMO. If one job is weaker in a specific fight and you want to provide the most you possibly can, you can just swap. It's that easy. I do think that as a healer, I was not very engaged though. Damage is very spiky with huge gaps in between, allowing me ample opportunity to stack mitigation for any pain points. It wasn't designed very well with healer challenges in mind, and the tank busters didn't come close to the highs that Valley Garmander hit earlier in the expansion. Despite that, I really do think this is a very solid first entry, and that it is definitely better than Erectonius, the opening encounter that Endwalker gave us. That much is not even close. I came out of my first clear of M1S feeling pretty positive about Light Heavyweight, and excited about Honeybee Lovely, what was my most eagerly anticipated turn coming out of normal mode. Expectations were high. The normal mode was fantastic. Simple yet fast-paced with the most chaotic phase we've seen in a normal mode in recent memory. Those hearts were intense, and Alarm Pheromones 2 caused big problems for melee. I remember before Savage released, I very excitedly said to my stream that this could well be the best encounter in the entire raid tier, and I couldn't wait for it. There was so much potential. And yet in hindsight, I believe that when all is said and done, it actually ended up being the worst. There's good too, but I was very sorely disappointed with the second turn we ended up receiving. I am no longer a Honeybee Lovely stan. One of the biggest issues I have with round 2 is that it just feels very samey. A hellish dreamscape of pairs, spread, in, out, and the occasional intercardinal dodges thrown at you again and again in morphing patterns as filler to mechanics that might even be easier than their normal mode iterations, to the increasingly shrill idle pop theme that perforates your very being.
Who's my obedient little babe?
It reminds me of Hegemony, the second boss of Abyssos, which had the exact same issue of the entire fight feeling like there were no peaks and valleys at all, no build-up, just a constant stream of phases that are difficult to distinguish from one another. It's fine. You'll remember what's coming next when it telegraphs, and it'll be easy enough to deal with regardless, because it's filler mechanics, the fight. That is when they matter, of course. Half of the time the challenges presented to you feel like they're fake and don't even exist. Case in point, during the first 2 beats, you'll be presented with stack markers that will apply hearts as well as dealing damage to those players within them, but you don't even really need to solve either of them. The first beat has you taking towers one by one, collecting hearts along the way that will leave a number of players at 3 stacks and the rest at 2 in an ideal circumstance, and then those remaining 2 stack players will take the stack marker that follows, avoiding the pirouetting hearts slowly spiraling across the arena simultaneously. But you are provided more leniency than you actually need in terms of hearts, so even if you mess up somewhere, it doesn't matter at all. On top of that, the heart mechanic is somehow easier than it is in normal. Why? Without the randomly placed pink AoEs around the arena to cut off your movement, make your path more restricted, forcing the party to carefully think about the space they use in order to avoid the AoEs, here in Savage you are completely free to do what you like, making it an almost non-existent challenge. In the second beat, because the number of hearts across the 2 stacks are fixed, and the system will automatically distribute them in such a way that is most favourable to the player, and the stacks across the entire fight do absolutely crazily negligible damage, that instead of carefully splitting your players, you can just double stack them without a care in the world. Just like in the first round, there are memory elements played very heavily into. That seems to be a common theme across this tier as a collective, in that they love to give you a cast bar that will telegraph a mechanic, in this case pairs or spread, and then do another entire mechanic in between using the resolution of that cast bar to cap off the phase to make sure you've been paying attention. Another funny note I wanted to quickly touch on is the fact that those AoE indicators for the center stage and outer stage dodges are messed up. The middle plus shaped hit is a lot smaller than the telegraph to the extent that it kind of feels like a mistake. Not everything I have to say about it is negative though. Whilst it is samey and mostly one note, I really did enjoy the way this encounter handled its enrage sequence. Every time a player maxes out on hearts and begins simping, Honeybee Lovely gains a stack that will see her replenish a chunk of HP. This is a great way of handling the progression cycle of an early turn of Savage as far as I'm concerned. The majority of the mechanics won't instantly wipe you for messing up, but as your errors accrue one by one, the finish line stretches further and further away, and victory at one point or another becomes an impossibility. Despite that, you can still practice all the way to the end and gain confidence. It's a good consistency check, which is honestly the main reason that Party Finder is having so many issues with M2S in terms of first-time clears. Consistency is not exactly their forte as a collective. I really like this because it allows you to learn despite failures, but you need to chain it all together with a decent degree of success in order to actually win. I don't want to see this implemented across the board to every fight ever, but I'd be pretty chuffed if we at least got enrage states akin to this more often. I think I was so disappointed with Honeybee Lovely because of the expectations which normal mode had set for me. Expectations that Savage just didn't end up living up to. I don't hate it by any means because it is a fairly honest, straightforward fight in which you can find joy in execution, especially when playing melee jobs and timing your uptime carefully. But I don't think it has that much of the special sauce that makes FF14 raid encounters so fun to me. The character and the impact she had on the community at large will absolutely stick with me. But her fight? Not so much. Brute Bomber in round 3 was an absolute joy of a normal mode. I feel like I've said that about all of the turns so far, and I'll say it about the 4th as well, just as a heads up, because Arcadion Normal was just a really impressive offering that put me in a very hopeful place for Savage. The main takeaway that I had was that this fight felt almost like it was pointed commentary from Square Enix, aimed directly at the raiding community. We hear you. You're going to have to work for your uptime from now on. Sink or swim, melee DPS. With his back-to-back lariats hurling him between the edges of the arena as players desperately expend all of their movement to keep up, this had the makings of a turn that might just break the trend of third encounters being shit. So now that Savage is all said and done, I'm happy to report that as far as I'm concerned, it lived up to the expectations and gave me exactly what I wanted from it. M3S is also a very honest fight that tests your Final Fantasy XIV fundamental capabilities. Funnily enough, it almost feels like Square Enix created a list of all of the trials they would want to put forth in a potential Hall of the Expert, and then they just embedded them firmly into the mechanical sequences present in this fight. There are no real debates, no deep and complex puzzles to solve, just see obstacle, overcome obstacle, on repeat for its entire runtime. The previous fight, which I was much more critical of, is similar in that it's also very honest, but to me the difference is that Brute Bomber's battle has a pace to it. It tutorializes you quickly, and then builds towards a peak, constantly compounding on the lessons you've learnt piecemeal, and then it ends in a bang. Literally. It asks for players to showcase their ability to quickly discern and react to cast bars, visual telegraphs, and solo indicators on themselves. It trials whether you can space out cooldowns, if your healers can deal with multiple intense instances of damage back to back, whether your melee can fight for uptime against unrelenting odds, and if your physical range DPS can stay awake. After the disappointment of Honeybee Lovely, the first thing that made me feel like this one would be better was after I saw Barbarous Barrage for the first time, a showcase of the fact that you don't need to introduce entirely new elements to make a mechanic give me an ear-to-ear grin. You just need to package it in a unique, fulfilling way that feels different to do than those that came before it. Taking 3 knockback towers back to back, watching the rest of your party ping-pong in all different directions before collecting for that final push to the one safe corner, it felt great to do, and it set the pacing very clearly. Tag Team is another one that I loved, partially because you could solve it equally well by creating patterns and rules as you can by just reacting. When it comes to those double lariat cleaves, there are so many systems and rules that you can create that will immediately solve both the first and the second, leaving you in the advantageous position of not even needing to check the safe spot for the second dashes, but you can also just use your eyes. I used eyes for all of progression before sitting down and critically solving it afterwards. It's also fun as heck to heal, and was absolutely the standout of the entire raid tier in terms of the challenges they presented to me as a healer main. The raid wides hitting like a truck, the ever-increasing number of brutal impacts acting as a great test of your ability to set up mitigation and provide supplementary heals partway through. Fuse Field, and at least I'm pretty sure it's called Fuse Field because there's like 6 million mechanics with fuse in the name, so I get them all mixed up. But you know the one that places 8 fuses of varying lengths on the ground? You have to pop them for massive damage, one by one, making sure not to fall behind or accidentally go too quickly. This is fun too, giving you agency on when that damage comes out to an extent, and a mixture of the sheer amount of damage combined with the check being long enough that you can't just stack everything all at once. You instead need to properly space out not only your tools, but your co-healers and ideally some from the rest of the party too. I also want to give an appreciative nod to the cheeky chip damage that gets thrown your way during Bombarian's special. You take those 5 hits, move out, back in, and then as the bomber prepares a slam from the top rope, you'll take a little chip damage. Then another hit as he lands, and then directly afterwards your spread or pair AoEs. These can catch unaware players by surprise easily, and I like that a lot. It's also a fantastic uptime encounter for melee DPS, as expected. The challenges presented to you really separate the wheat from the chaff, and there is some insanely fun tech you can do on jobs like Viper and Monk to eke out every little GCD you can muster. Brute Bomber and Honeybee Lovely aim to fulfill similar roles within a raid tier, as far as I'm concerned at least. They're both pretty straightforward fights that aim to test similar skill sets, but M3S pulled it off so much better that it became a real highlight of the tier to me. It was a really fun fight that I'm excited every time I hit Enter Duty on. And then at last, we come to Wicked Thunder. This had the most question marks going into Savage. Would it be a door boss? How would the normal mode convert into a Savage encounter? With her ability to conjure wings and cannons with Electro, the possibilities of new configurations were totally feasible, and the prospects of imaginative set pieces felt endless. Both turns are the most complex and multi-layered, and we could expect that the biggest change from normal mode would be found here. And going into Savage, my hopes were admittedly sky high. The opening minutes nailed every single thing I was praying for, and in some cases surpassed them. Frantic and fast-paced, flanked with high damaging raid hits that demand mitigation and a fast sequence of witch hunts that felt great to execute. They had different patterns and permutations to deal with, and had a relatively high execution requirement in the case of narrowing and widening witch hunt. Speaking of narrowing and widening, it is easily in my top 3 mechanics this tier because it fulfills almost everything I love about Final Fantasy XIV mechanics. Multiple patterns, execution requirements, numerous viable solutions that will work with high levels of success, intuitive to learn and understand, but not passable on your first try blind, and more than all else, fun and satisfying to complete. A handful of signature Square Enix tutorialization moments later, and we're moving on to Lightning Cage, yet another mechanic which I think is fantastic fun. The solution just kind of makes sense, and you get a few seconds less than traditionally would be offered for these kinds of puzzles to coordinate players into their final positions for each timer of the debuff, which helps to elevate it further. This actually reminded me a lot of the Titan Maximum Uplift puzzles from E4S, to the extent that I was kind of surprised it only really cropped up as a full-on puzzle once. I also loved the little melee uptime trick that you can do here, and it feels like an intentional allowance was made to enable it. The timing is tight but fair, with clear telegraphing as the debuff expires. The third win in a row is Ion Cannon, which almost immediately follows. Whilst everyone now is doing one of 50 slight variants of the exact same strat with no worthwhile changes whatsoever, there are many, many more solutions that do work. At this point you've probably noticed that I'm quite the fan of mechanics with more than one resolution, but what makes Ion Cannon special to me is just how hard it hits, and that it occurs during a natural 2-minute burst window. This part is really intense as a healer if you're trying to play with any level of optimization, and even for those jobs without as high mitigation requirements, it's one of the key parts of the encounter on the whole that requires you to zone in and focus more. The entire first half of Wicked Thunder is just absolute peak, and it sets up a truly memorable round 4. The transition is just so cool as well, with Electro slowly taking over as the music changes and the mechanics add to the intensity. The atmosphere is unbeatable, and this is the moment where we learn without a shadow of a doubt that for the first time in an expansion and a half, we have a full-length final boss, rather than a checkpoint encounter. Unfortunately, it's here that I feel there is a little bit of a nosedive in terms of pacing. Whilst thematically amazing with a soundtrack to match, I feel like chunks of the second half of this fight were lacking. The Sabbath mechanics were fairly interesting, and I loved the opening foray of the intensely hard-hitting raid wides directly into the light party exaflares, but the filler mechanics felt like they'd be right at home in an EX trial, and they broke the pacing up to the extent that I felt it was a little harmful to the overall experience. Mustard Bomb is the most egregious example here. The first time is alright, I guess, even if fairly uninteresting, but why on earth does it repeat completely unchanged right at the end of the fight? I don't understand. I also think that the stockpile tail mechanics were good as a test of memory, and the first few times they occurred it was reasonable enough standalone, but I was very much expecting some kind of instance of them being paired with another challenge. Heck, maybe even staggering the Mustard Bomb out a little and combining it there with the tail could have been a nice easy way to build up the expectations for that finale. That said, I like all of the Sabbaths and Sword Quiver too. Despite none of them being overly complex, they fit perfectly, each managing to keep a level of intensity through either their speed or, in the case of second Ion Cannons, you standing in your spot and hoping and praying everyone else gets to theirs in time. Sword Quiver is what I consider to be a perfect enrage push. It's a pure pressure check. Nothing there is difficult whatsoever, but it deals enough damage and lasts long enough that you actually need to consider your resources carefully, and you need to react to which spots are actually safe fast to avoid a series of unfortunate events. Not having a door boss for the first time since E8S was such a welcome change. My firm stance is that variety is the spice of life when it comes to encounter design. and I love getting both door bosses and fully fledged fights like this, and I want them to come with no rhyme or reason whatsoever. I would just appreciate if next time we weren't waiting a good 4 years in between those types of fights. With that said, I do think that both Titan and Shiva, the last two non-split final turns, are better as a complete package than Wicked Thunder is. That's not to say M4S is bad. The more I've gotten to do it, the more I've come to appreciate it, and I do like it a whole bunch. But to be blunt, the peaks here were just lower against the stiff competition that is two of my favorite fights in the game's history. It's also here that I need to discuss one of the hottest topics surrounding Light-Heavyweight Savage since its release, because as always, I got some opinions to yap about. The DPS check. For those not quite as in the loop, the DPS checks this tier were extremely lenient throughout. If we factor in specifically M4S alone, the highest check of the lot, there were week 1 kills on record, pushing double digits deaths that still managed to claim victory. There were even claims that the tier itself was of poor quality solely because of the DPS checks being so lacking. To make it clear, I don't agree with that. I do believe that difficulty is an important metric in the level of fulfillment you receive from a raid tier, especially if you're week 1 raiding, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. I think you can have an easy tier that still contains an abundance of enjoyment from going through the dance steps correctly, one by one. Case in point, this very raid tier, because I do agree that relative to the average player skill level right now, this is probably the easiest raid tier we've been handed ever. The closest we've come was Deltascape all the way back in Stormblood, the raid tier that infamously marked the advent of Red Mage and was speed proc through the heavy use of chain raises and invulnerabilities. This tier is somewhat similar. Square Enix have clearly been listening to feedback from the community, sometimes a little too much, and have drastically cut back on body checks, and alongside this, the punishment from failure states has been lessened in the first place. Light Heavyweight was the perfect storm to create the quickest Savage tier in Final Fantasy XIV history. Very few body checks, lenient DPS checks, a strange absence of puzzle mechanics that took more than one single pull to solve, almost no group-wide damage downs or heavy punishments for failure, combined with the lenient DPS checks and one of the strongest crops of world racing groups we've ever witnessed. All this coming immediately after a swathe of knee-jerk buffs to jobs across the board on the very day the tier released, to avoid nerfing the overwhelmingly popular Pictomancer, which honestly I think was a contributing factor in why the damage requirements themselves are so lenient in the first place. Despite this, I do think the checks are too easy. I think that Savage is in a uniquely advantageous position compared to other pinnacle raiding content like Ultimate in terms of balancing, because through its sheer nature, intentionally, it becomes easier week on week. It has a minimum item level relative to the start of a patch gearing cycle, and yet after that, the players will grow in more than 20 eye levels of strength in the following weeks, making it easier and easier to push through and grasp a clear naturally. When it comes to Light Heavyweight, I'm curious to witness just how lax the performance requirements will be to clear when everybody is closing in on best in slot. You already skip multiple mechanics easily on a relatively clean run. My prediction is that in another month, entire phases will simply be unseen in all but the messiest party finder runs. The real debate from all of this is whether Savage should be easier than it traditionally has been since Stormblood's release. Should a week 1 clear be permissible for all who complete the mechanic successfully? Should their damage efficiency be trialed? Or is that a less important skill in high-end play in the game of today? For me, I've done hardcore and week 1 progression in many Savage tiers at this point, and the ones I remember fondly are the ones that I felt I truly earned. The ones where my party didn't stumble our way through the final phases with deaths aplenty, gaining victory regardless, and laughing about how we didn't really deserve it and we were surprised that it went our way in the first place. Final floors where I felt pushed to try my utmost to execute well, where it mattered how efficient my healing was, and where I had to make sure to play safely because more than 1 or 2 deaths would spell instant doom to the attempt. In Endwalker, as much as I personally liked the Abyssos check and would love to see something akin to that once more, I think the actual healthiest check overall was in Asphodelos. It was reasonable. Any composition was able to clear, including a cursed double-ranged comp in the first week. And on a clean run, 8 players pressing their buttons to an average level and doing all mechanics cleanly would secure a clear. Those with higher capabilities, uptime strats and carefully planned mitigation could afford 1 or 2 player deaths and still make the cut. To me, this is where week 1 of Savage should be. With each Tuesday reset that comes by, the gates creak ever further open, providing more room for error. Just the way it should be. I think that any player is capable of clearing Savage on content should they apply themselves. And I believe the reason so many aspire to do so is because it is just that, aspirational content that is a sign of just how far you've come and grown as a player. That's why checks akin to Asphodelos are my preference. I want to chase that clear. I want to get that feeling of elation of overcoming something that tested me, rather than the much lesser feelings I had for tiers like Anabasios and this one. I want others to feel the good version as well. I do have a few things to reel off about the tier as an entirety. Firstly, aside from M1S, I felt this was a very unimaginative and honestly flat out engaging and bad tier for tanks. There wasn't all that much to do. Boss positioning was still mostly very simple and uninteresting, even with the much welcome reduction in hitbox sizes. Tank busters especially were just flat out poorly done. After the high expectations set by how cool Valley Garmander's tower mechanic was, I was hoping for more. Honestly, for healers as well. M3S was good for healers, as were sections of M4S like Ion Cannon, and I really liked the persistent damage over the entire beats of M2S, especially with their potential to chip away at your mitigation right before the heavy finale hits. But M1S was really unengaging to heal, as was the second half of M4S. I reiterate my point from Endwalker that I'd really like to see the combat designers play into messing with the damage profiles more often. To present unique mitigation challenges, especially as a healer, I need more spot healing and more full phases of healing. I also missed having more puzzle mechanics. They felt strangely lacking from this tier. We don't need a ton, but 1 or 2 more than what we got would go a long way. I need a good head scratcher to solve. I do think the tier as an entirety was a little bit too simple in places as well. Or rather than being too simple as an entirety, they are the right level of complexity, but are missing some of those elevated set-piece mechanics that create the peaks that make Savage feel, well, savage. Something unrelated from design though, is that aesthetically and presentation-wise, this tier is my favorite ever. Each boss is a huge personality oozing with charm, and standing tall over each and every one of them was the announcer. My god, I love him. He's funny and quotable and the perfect level of campy, and the English voice actor is probably the coolest guy ever. What the fuck? I think every tier now needs an announcer just because it added so much hilarity to pulls. I think Light Heavyweight was okay. I enjoyed it for what it was, and the more runs I've accrued, I've grown to appreciate it more. It's definitely a grower. However, I do feel it has weaknesses, and the DPS check is not even amongst the top 3 of those. Its design from the very heart prevents it from being truly great, but it is good fun. I'm just not sure it lives up to the expectations set by the rest of dawntrail's content thus far. Now I'm going to end because otherwise this video will be rambling about stupid things for another 30 minutes. So, I'd like to hand the floor over to you. What do you think of the raid tier? Do you have an encounter you love the most? Let me know in the comments section, because I'm looking forward to hearing what people have to say about this. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.